Hi, I'm Simon K. Jones, and you're listening to the audio version of my ongoing detective serial, Tales from the Triverse. Previously, Detective Lola Stiles has arrived in the city of Laon to investigate a murder. Laon, 3203, early Verdant. There was a man on the door, a human. He recognised Christian and waved them inside, the noise of the rains lessening somewhat. Lola's eyes slowly adjusted to the relatively darker interior. It had once been a home, albeit one repurposed for use as a safe house for the rebels. Now it was evidence. The walls of the entrance were scratched as if a knife had been run along the paintwork. Into the next room, a general living space, and it had clearly been the scene of a fight. Furniture had been left overturned, feathers from shredded cushions still drifting about, disturbed by their movements. The wall lanterns were smashed, the walls beneath streaked with oil and wax. There were no bodies in the room, but Lola could already smell something fetid and rotten emanating from deeper into the house. Blood painted the walls. Whatever had happened in that room had been more than a mere scrap. "How many were here?" she asked. Christian grimaced. 7, in addition to Galen himself, all highly trained. She nodded. Then they were attacked by more opponents, or more skilled opponents? It would not have been easy. I trained some of them myself. Christian looked about the room, clearly dismayed. Galen was one of the founders of the modern Akehu. He was a mentor to me for a while. "I'm sorry," she said, moving carefully about the room, trying not to disturb anything. They'd sent orders that nothing be touched, but it had taken them nearly 2 days riding to travel to Laon. Lola had no doubt that the local rebels would have caused some contamination. It was just her and Christian. There was no point all of them traipsing through the place, and Lycasra had other business to be getting on with in the city. Lola could feel Christian's eyes on her back as she worked, examining the room for a sense of what had happened. She needed a sequence of events, so that they could build a picture and perhaps figure out who had done this. Who else would have known about the safe house? In theory, only other cell leaders. Is there a chance it was an inside job, one of our own? It's not impossible, but the brutality makes no sense. Lola said nothing but cast a glance in the man's direction. Christian, and the rebels generally, had a reputation for their own brutality, so it wasn't too much of a stretch to think that tensions could have driven rival cells against one another. A path of streaked blood led from the room through a doorway. "Bodies were dragged," she said, pointing. She took a handkerchief from her pocket and held it to her nose and mouth. She'd worked enough crime scenes to know when it was about to get nasty, and this particular incident had been festering in the Laon humidity for at least 3 days. She moved through to the next room. More blood and viscera, scattered lumps of unidentifiable meat that had once belonged inside someone. Frames still hung on the walls, but the paintings within were shredded or stained beyond recognition. Blood on the floor, the walls, the ceiling even. Before arriving, she'd assumed it was a gang incident, or perhaps a targeted assassination from the authorities. The rebels had pissed off enough people in enough places to fill an entire notebook with potential suspects. There'd been no survivors, no warning given. The attack had been swift and relentless. It was already looking like something else, and she hadn't yet set eyes on the bodies. Whatever had happened was more violent and more primal than an assassination or some local squabble. Through to the next room. There they were, all the bodies, piled high in the centre, a tangle of limbs and torsos and heads. She stepped carefully, though there was no avoiding the carpet of congealed blood. "Look at this," she said quietly, glancing back to check that Christian was following. "There's something ritualistic about this?" Forcing herself to look back at the massacre, she tried to discern one victim from another. Their flesh had intermingled and slipped together. "They weren't merely killed," Christian said. "They were slaughtered, and their bodies desecrated. Galen was a great man. We must find those responsible. This cannot stand." "Do we know when this happened? What time of day, I mean?" "I've spoken to some of the others in the local cell who were positioned elsewhere in the city. They'd been checking in regularly, so we know it was between dusk and dawn." Lola nodded, thinking of the busy streets, which stayed active long after sundown. Even if it was night, there's no way anyone involved with this could have walked out the front door without being spotted. They'd have been covered in blood. She moved around the outer edge of the room. Turning away from the bodies, she examined the walls. One spot was especially bloody, as if something had been lifted vertically, or perhaps had climbed. Looking up, she clocked a skylight in the ceiling. Up there, she said, pointing. They probably went out that way, wouldn't have been spotted. Christian assessed the climb. That's not easy. Even I'd struggle to climb up that wall and over to the skylight. Who could? Vaen'ka, perhaps? He nodded. If anyone could. Even then they'd have to be especially athletic, but it wouldn't be Koth. They'd just fly up. Lola shook her head. That skylight looks too small to me for a Koth to fit through. So we're talking someone with magic, or some nimble Vaen'ka, perhaps. Focusing again on the centre of the room, she paddled over, her shoes squelching unpleasantly. The smell was unbearable, and she wouldn't be able to linger in there for much longer. She needed a closer look at the bodies before they were taken away. The dismembered limbs were not severed cleanly, not a bladed weapon then, or at least not one competently handled. It looked more like they'd been hacked and slashed at, perhaps with a kitchen knife. Also, there were bite marks. That she had not been expecting. She could feel her insides about to rebel. It'd be good to get up on that roof. In retrospect, going up on the roof during Leon's rainy season was not one of Lola's finest ideas. She squinted against a torrent of water, holding a hand to her forehead in an attempt to keep her eyes clear. She'd become entirely soaked within moments of climbing up from the courtyard, every layer of clothing feeling as if she had only that moment stepped out of a swimming pool. Leon was designed to cope with the deluge, but straying from the designated paths was a fast reminder of how much liquid was pouring down on the city. One thing for sure was that there would be no evidence left up there on the rooftops, no trail to follow, no handy footsteps. The attackers would have emerged bloodied, but any telltale signs had been washed away days earlier. Whatever had happened in that safe house was not an ordinary killing. Whether related to rebel activity or a local incident or a good old-fashioned random murder, nothing about the killings made sense. There was no message, no warning. It was more animalistic than anything else, raw and primal, yet the piling of the bodies had seemed like a deliberate act. It was hard to imagine anything other than a large and powerful group pulling it off, given the lack of resistance. But Christian insisted there were no organisations that fit the bill. It was hard to see how an individual, a lone attacker, could have pulled it off. It wasn't an isolated incident, Lola knew in her gut. Nobody murdered an entire house, sliced up the bodies, and stacked them high, without having done it before, which meant it would likely happen again. She needed to find a way to talk to the local city guard. Thanks for listening. You can leave a comment and find lots more over on the newsletter at simonkjones.substack.com.